Hello, Crystal. How are you? All right. So what we're covering today are the Roaring 20s. All right. And so with the Roaring 20s, good afternoon. Thank you. You as well, for sure. Do you have any questions before I begin? Any questions at all, huh? Okay. All right. So hopefully no news is good news. Good. That's all right. That's all right. All right. So I don't know if you've had a chance to read the introduction, but you talk about a, a culture war. You find one in the 1920s, right? And very broadly speaking, a culture war, those who were embracing the modern changes that were that were being undertaken and experienced, and those who were frightened by those changes. All right. And so what were some of those changes? Is for one, right? Is people, just because this was the predominant culture does not mean, just like going back to the Puritans, doesn't mean that that everyone adhered to it, because I'm sure everyone did not. But at least culturally, the Victorian era called for propriety, sexual morality, adherence to notions of like Judeo-Christian principles, right? Don't have sex unless you're married. Um, be frugal with your money and responsible, and save money and don't spend irresponsibly or borrow irresponsibly. Uh, just so much just on propriety. And in the 1920s, right, you have a youth culture, especially. You have a Hollywood culture. You have a top-down presidential culture under Warren G. Harding that seemed to be really laissez-faire, like just let it go, let it be, just do your thing, go wild, right? That's part of the name that's given, the Roaring 20s. Of course, it's predominantly referring to economics, but it's intertwined with that image and that title, the Roaring 20s, of people just going crazy. And so for the first time in the 1920s, you had a large segment of kids going to college. The number of kids going to college tripled. And we're not talking about JCs in which you could live at home still, but going away to college, living away in a dormitory, etc. And so all the experiences that come with that, right? And it was said to have prolonged the adolescent stage of young men and women, so that they weren't encumbered by all the responsibilities of adulthood right away, but they had time to think about what they wanted to do, time to sow their wild oats, etc., etc. So you had a lot more kids going to college, and a lot of them were young women. And then you also have a lot of kids moving into or near cities. And a city, for whatever arbitrary reason, is defined as a settlement of 2,500 people or more. So the percentage of Americans living in cities by the 1920 census had constituted a majority. And so a lot of young men and women moving near or to cities or in suburbs around them. Then you also have the fact that disposable income, according to Larry Schweikart in his book on U.S. history, disposable income at one 5-year period during the 1920s went up 37% per capita. So that's per person, not just the wealthy, not just the middle class, but that includes everyone. On average, went up 37%. And so now, in addition to that, lots of things were available on credit. And so that was huge. I look here in my notes, and I have stats like, give me just 1 minute here. Come on. Well, I thought I was going to show you. I had stats on credit, that I wanted to share, although I'll get back to that when we do the Great Depression. Okay, so if you'll indulge me, I don't know why I'm unable to find it right now, so let's see here, spending, here's some. In 1925, 3/4 of furniture, phonographs, washing machines were bought on credit. Over 12 million households bought a radio. $5 million was spent a week in 1925. 50 million, I'm sorry, was spent per week in 1925 on the movie theaters. Families bought vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, freezers, washing machines, et cetera, and especially automobiles. And so much of that they bought on credit. And then advertising, according to the textbook, came of age. And so it began to really generate a culture that deviated away from the culture of puritanical saving and telling Americans, right, it's the American thing to do. We're hitting prosperity, spend. It's good for the economy. You're entitled to it. You need to be happy, et cetera. They exploited people's fears. Lots of the female products, right? Like if you don't, you're going to end up meeting the man of your dreams and you won't have the proper makeup on or the proper attire on, and you'll lose him. And all kinds of psychological fear factors involved in advertising in the 1920s and appealed to people's fantasies, their fears, celebrities, etc. And so all of this is coalescing together, right? And then you have young women who, by and large, are getting married less often. I believe the numbers went from about 1/4 of women not marrying to down to or up to 1/3. 1 out of 3 women not marrying during the 1920s. Divorces went from 1 out of 10 to 1 out of 6. And so divorces went up. 2/3 of those divorces were initiated by women. So this was all alarming to some people. And so with the young women, a lot of them got jobs in pink collar jobs, in addition to the old school pink collar jobs, like being a laundress, working to clean people's homes, being a elementary school teacher or a nurse. Now a lot of white collar jobs opened up that were considered simultaneously pink collar, like telephone operators and secretaries and other clerical type jobs. And according to the textbook, they began making about on average $22 a week when it cost about $25 a week to be self-sufficient. So they were almost becoming economically self-sufficient. And so with women making money like that, they have an experience at the workplace with camaraderie with other women, and it supposedly was very eye-opening, hearing of other women that they work with not marrying or having an abusive husband, and she left him, and so forth. It had supposedly an emboldening effect on the women, and not to mention having worked in the fire and the not the fire, but the protective war effort industries during World War I, right? And so all this is going to enhance the self-confidence, collective self-confidence of young women. And it's also going to empower them to be able to spend more money and spend more time on leisure prior to getting married and having kids. And so you have electrification that began in the 1890s and really had taken its development to a new level by the 1920s. So you have nightlife now. Jazz music is going to come of age, and it's going to take the country by storm. Jazz and vaudeville acts, and of course the Harlem Renaissance, etc. And so the popular image in the press was of this new woman. That was I have the hiccups, the generic term for this new generation of women. And this new generation, right? She flaunted the old Victorian restrictions over women. Women weren't supposed to act according to Victorian culture in any way that was considered masculine. So smoking in public, cutting and bobbing their hair short, wearing loose clothing, and not wearing, corsets with suffocating dresses. Um, Engaging in leisure activities that usually men engaged in, going out and meeting people of the opposite sex that they weren't married to, and having liaisons, and coming and going and moving on from those. Because the Victorian era was all about double standards. So the young men went just as allegedly wild as the young women did, but it was a much bigger deal that the women had because of those double standards. And so if you look up documentaries on the Roaring 20s, on the proverbial flapper, you'll see plenty of pictures and depictions of women dancing, smoking, meeting men, just having an audacity about them that seemed to have been vacant during the Victorian era. And like I said, opportunities now to go to clubs, to dance halls, to cabarets, and these other public places of leisure, and enjoy themselves, oftentimes going with one another as co-workers and friends, etc. And so this greatly scared the conservatives, right? This new youth culture. And it was epitomized, like I said, also by Hollywood. When you look at Hollywood, I read an interesting book that demonstrated an interesting evolution from Mary Pickford being the leading actress. And she kind of played a lot of the old school separate sphere oriented image of woman, whereby she was dependent upon men. She was kind of helpless. She was very ladylike. She was kind of innocent and naive, very charming, etc. And then you have an evolution in the 20s where people really followed Clara Bow. And Clara Bow would be with more than one man in her movie, but oftentimes have a negative result from that. And then you had Louise Brooks by the end of the 20s. And Louise Brooks, in both the screen and in her private life, practically boasted of how many men she had slept with, etc. And so people saw spouses leave one another for another actor, et cetera, during the 1920s. The kind of wild lifestyles of the Hollywood stars was highly publicized for everyone to see. And instead of being just absolutely, aghast about it, a lot of Americans just, they chewed on it like juicy gossip. They loved it. It sold. And so you have that going on as well. And so then you had an investigation in Muncie, Indiana, and they discovered things that were very alarming to the conservatives. Half of the young ladies asked at this college admitted to having had premarital sex, which was, oh my goodness, back then, coming from the Victorian era. And like I said, not that may not have been the case before that, but they were at least secret about it. And so now they're open about it. Some of the love letters they came across were just very, very devoid of old romanticism, right? Like I'm starving for your body, stuff that was very forward, and so forth. And this got lots of publicity, this Muncie, Indiana investigation. And so the conservatives, they said, see, our country's going to hell in a handbasket. Our youth are going wild. And so, and then not to mention the black and tans. The black and tans were the desegregated or integrated cabarets and dance halls and jazz halls, etc., across the country in a lot of the major cities, where you have pictures of it to this day of black and white participants dancing together as dance partners. And nothing was to stop them from leaving the dance together. And so such was the fear of jazz music and these dance halls creating not only sexual immorality, but also, racial miscegenation, interethnic sex, that it scared the heck out of conservatives. You find that in the Third Reich of Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler banned jazz music in Germany and Nazi Germany, and arrested some of the leaders of their swing clubs and other types of dance clubs and so forth, because he said it was, quote, Negro music, and it encouraged them to drop all of their inhibitions and to mix ethnically. So at any rate, you have all that going on with the new woman and with this new youth culture going on during the 1920s. The moderns, as they call themselves, said, hey, these are the signs of the times. We have to evolve. This is the way the world's going. And the traditionalists were frightened by this, and obviously were alarmed and wanted to put a stop to it, to try to control it. Then you have the Harlem Renaissance, and very interesting in that the Harlem Renaissance had a series of factors occurred regarding the Harlem Renaissance that create a good debate as to how successful the Harlem Renaissance was or was not. And to me, it was at least twofold. I'm sure it was more than that, but at least these two factors I know of from what I've read. Is one is it's develop a sense of pride amongst African Americans. The term Black is Beautiful by Marcus Garvey became big in the 1920s. And so because when you look at something as simple as like aesthetics, right, a culture's subjective take on beauty, and they would decide, right, that the blonde Barbie doll was the example of female beauty. But what about, curlier hair, darker skin, etc. And so this was fascinating. Another component to being proud of being Black, besides aesthetics and not wanting to have white America make them feel ugly and unwanted, was a pride in culture creating capacity. Adolf Hitler, some of the worst racists in the world, Houston Stewart, Chamberlain, Gobineau, some of these other scientific racist writers, they would contend that some races, as they used that term back then, were inferior because they were incapable of creating culture. They had to borrow from other people because they didn't have the collective creativity, talent, intelligence, agency to make it happen. And so with the Harlem Renaissance, there was a lot of focus on African achievements. And so there was, sculpting, art, writing, but also history, and looking back at Timbuktu and the Kingdom of Mali and these other great heydays in Africa itself, to try to demonstrate to the world and to remind one another as African Americans that they were as capable of creating culture as anyone else. And then thirdly, they wanted, by and large, because not all of them did, but by and large, at least initially, it seems as if they wanted integration into white WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant America. They wanted to be accepted. They wanted to join. They no longer be marginalized and segregated. They wanted to earn the white man's approval and respect and tolerance. And so at any rate, we're going to get further into that in a minute. So then let's see here. This one talks about the economy roaring at this time. So car ownership more than doubled. The gross national product nearly doubled from 23 to 29, the value of all products produced in a given year, right? Let's see here. Per capita income had increased from 522 to to $716 between 21 and 29 in real terms. And again, that's per capita, that's average per person. But then Warren G. Harding, his Teapot Dome scandal, his scandal with having an affair and a woman claiming that she had a daughter through him. His Secretary of Justice took off with money for the veterans, literally left for Europe for a while to hide and try to escape justice. Albert Fall and a couple other guys involved in the Teapot Dome scandal actually served prison sentences from the president's cabinet, which was a first. With the Teapot Dome scandal, for instance, right? There was oil reserves in Elk Hills, California, and Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and they were controlled by the Navy because the Navy knew it was going from coal-based, steam-based engine technology to electrical, diesel-oriented, gas-oriented technology. And so it sat on that oil. Well, Albert Fall totally made this up, said that the oil was leaking underground and going onto private places and escaping. So that it was in the best interest and imperative for the government to extract that oil right then and there. But he said that the Navy didn't have the know-how and the means to do it. So why don't they sign it over to the Department of the Interior? Because supposedly the Department of Interior could deal with those leaks better. Well, no sooner gets into the Department of the Interior that he grants rights to a private company of one of his best friends. And those two best friends that he had, one in Elk Hills, California, the other one at Teapot Dome, Wyoming, ended up each giving him about $200,000 to $300,000 in cash and in bond certificates in return for letting them use the oil. And so just all kinds of scandals under Warren G. Harding. When you look at the biography of him, it's tempting to make him a mini example, a microcosm of the 20s, that people kind of didn't know him very well. He was a pretty private type guy, but very outwardly gregarious and would speak often, and but didn't seem to have a lot of depth to his platform. But people loved his profile, his looks. He looked presidential. And so people like that. So very superficial. And he was healthy and robust coming in his mid-50s, coming into president. And he only made it 3 years. He didn't even finish his 4-year term. And he got sick and died in San Francisco. And a lot of it, they said, contended with the stress of all the scandals that were hanging over his head. And so some people use him as a microcosm of that. If you'll indulge me one more, he had a regular spot in DC where a guy named Jess Smith would take bribes from bootleggers so that they wouldn't be arrested because prohibition, right, against alcohol. And so he had his own account, a fake account with, I have no idea how much money. And the word got out, they started to investigate him, and he started talking and divulging information, not only about himself, but about a few other members of the cabinet. And he mysteriously died, shot in the head, and they ruled it as a suicide, claimed that they lost the gun. And it was just very suspicious. So that those types of things just haunted Warren G. Harding's presidency from 20 to 23. So much so that his vice president who came in, Calvin Coolidge, they tried to do just the opposite of Harding's image. When Coolidge came in, they loved that Coolidge was simple, kind of a country bumpkin, loved to fish, didn't like to talk much, drank milk instead of whiskey, and so forth. And so that kind of puritanical, pure image was just what the Republican Party needed to try to salvage the reputation of Warren G. Harding's presidency. And then after him, a third Republican will become elected, and his name was Herbert Hoover. And Herbert Hoover was seen as as a rising star from rags to riches, born in like Iowa, very poor, but he was a brilliant engineer and began working for some of the biggest companies in the world, throughout the world, and then got a job on the cabinet handling finances and food during World War I. Supposedly did very well for that. And so then they ran him for president and he easily won as a successful businessman. And of course, as you know, by 32, when he was president from 28 to 32, the Great Depression hit, right, in October of 29. And they're going to blame him and the Republicans for the Depression. And so he'll be a one-term president and lose to Franklin Roosevelt, who will institute a New Deal. The assignment we'll do after this one, after the tests. All right. So all this going on. Now the questions, I'm going to stop sharing this. All right. And I'm going to share instead. Let's see here. Where is it? Come on. Where are you? Like, how do I find more? Show all windows. Sorry about that. I should have shut the others down before our meeting. Here it is. All right, so hopefully you can see this. So in choosing your number, should you choose number 1, to whatever extent it was accurate, what factors do you believe may have contributed to women's empowerment, liberation, or defiance of Victorian norms? For instance, economic empowerment, an increase in the number of young ladies going to college, the media, the automobile, Freud, postmodernism, etc. So for one, right, women had gained, this was an evolution. It just didn't suddenly come out of nowhere in the 1920s. In the 1800s, women began garnering rights in the courts. During the 1840s, a lot of men headed west and never returned and abandoned their wives. So the wives sued them in court using the old paradigm of separate spheres, that women are inherently more virtuous than men, but weaker and more fragile, more dependent upon others for help. And so hence they said, oh, just little us, we're being left behind by our husbands. We need some recourse for that. So now the husbands owe them money, child support. The women are getting custody rights. All of that starts really working for them during the 1840s. By the 1870s, some major decisions had been made and women were able to control their own property. Because remember, under English common law that we inherited, coverture had been the case before, whereby a woman's legal identity, her property and wealth became covered, became usurped by her husband the moment she married him. So now a woman could keep her independent property, inherit and keep that property, and it didn't go to the husband any longer. Keep her own salaries, etc. Then you have the benevolent clubs, the benevolent societies, and the reforms prior to the Civil War in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. Women gained political experiences fighting for other people. They fought against child labor. They fought against slavery. They fought against alcohol consumption. They fought for prison reform. They fought for educational reform. And in doing that, they learned the tricks of the trade. They learned to go out and get signatures and get petitions. They learned to address the legislative body at whatever level was necessary, whether it be a city council, a state legislator, or even Congress. They learned rallies and gave public speeches, which was seen to be scandalous, God forbid, for a woman to speak publicly, right, to a group of men as well as women. But they began to do it finally in the mid-1800s. And so at any rate, yeah, that starts all galvanizing women. You have Seneca Falls in 1849, when women declared their Declaration of Sentiments and appealed to the Declaration of Independence contending that all men and women are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights, and that those rights women are entitled to as well. So some of the early women were like Mary Wollstonecraft was a Brit. Sarah Stearns and Julia B. Nelson were in Minnesota in the mid 1800s. And they made the argument that would be commonly embraced today, that women are just as capable in every capacity as men. Because notice what some of the feminists did is they rode on the old separate sphere paradigm. They said, oh, we women, yes, we're more fragile, but we're more virtuous, and that we'll bring a virtuous, soft touch of morality to politics. So you let us vote and wars will end, and society will be kinder to the less fortunate, etc. Now, some really believe that, and some it was a pragmatic decision, saying the men are not ready to hear that we're no different from them, that we're just as capable of them in every way. But so let's just run with their stereotypes, right? And tell them that we're going to bring a soft touch to politics. And so speaking of which, some of the major leaders in the mid to late 1800s, they went back and forth on currying that type of old school stereotype or trying to fight against it. So for instance, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, right? And so they fought hard against those things. But yet sometimes, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, for instance, would not speak would not open up a feminist session, without her husband doing it first. And Susan B. Anthony was angry about it. Susan B. Anthony, a little bit more bold, went back to New York and voted, even though she knew she'd get arrested for it. She voted, was arrested, went to jail, and she happily did so to make a statement, because technically the state constitution stated any person born in the state, et cetera, et cetera. She said, I'm a person, and so I should vote. And then, especially by the time of the 19 teens, you had Alice Paul. And Alice Paul and the ladies really took a very forward stance and saying, hey, we're women, we could do what men can do. Heck with the separate spheres argument about us bringing our dainty feminine morality to politics. We are just as rational and capable as men, and we want the vote. And so they chained themselves to the White House fence and were arrested. They went on hunger strike when they were inside the jail, and the prison guards force-fed them and sprayed a fire hose on them, and all of it got out on the press. And sadly, even by the 19 teens, they got bad publicity, saying basically they deserved it, that they weren't like women, that they were, I mean, so America was really far behind socially as far as the feminist movement. But all the more reason why these women were so brave in doing this. And so then you had others lead the way. You had Elizabeth Blackwell and Lucy Stone get college degrees, and a big deal was made of that. I think it was one of the two, Lucy Stone or Elizabeth Blackwell, at an integrated college getting her degree, became valedictorian, and they would not allow her to give the speech because she was a woman. They said she could write it and a man could read it for her. And she said, no, thanks. So at any rate, yeah, I know. So at any rate, yeah, you have all this that precedes the 1920s, right? So then women entered the public sphere during World War I. Remember, a lot of women were progressive leaders, so they gained further experience in the progressive movement. Remember the settlement house movement of helping out the poor immigrant families in the urban areas and providing school and childcare and all kinds of vocational training and all kinds of services to the poor. That was largely women, middle-class women. And so at any rate, And then the Industrial Revolution is going to put more of them into white collar, but slash pink collar jobs, right? So all of that happened first. Did all that have a lot to do with the woman, the new woman of the 1920s? That's for you to decide. Then economic progress, the growth of the middle class, with household appliances, bakeries, laundries, they no longer required the time being a housewife. These were major labor saving devices. And so women literally developed more time on their hands and they used it. Okay, urbanization, being near other workers, being near a large population of people, rubbing elbows with people from different walks of life, that may have greatly helped as well. And of course, as I mentioned, college. Oberlin College was the first famous one in Ohio to open up to women in the mid 1800s. And then Wesley, I don't know if that's spelled correctly, and neither do I know if the third one. Bryn Mawr was an all-ladies school. So the majority of colleges were still not co-ed. A lot of the colleges in the mid to late 1800s were female colleges like Bryn Mawr. But nevertheless, Bryn Mawr was like the equivalent of an Ivy League school for women. So in the 20s, that went up threefold. So marriages were postponed. Fewer women were getting married. More women were getting divorced. Women were almost becoming economically self-sufficient, as you see with those stats on number 2, making about 22 a week on average per capita. And then to what extent was it also a sense of disillusionment in the 1920s? You know, I've read that, you know, recently an author that was saying that there does seem to be a pendulum swing in history, that oftentimes America being no different, that you'll have oscillation between periods of intense reform where they're trying to improve and change society. And then eventually the next generation or so tires of that and they become more insulated and more conservative and want to just keep the status quo. And so is this part of that natural, almost natural process? Is during the 1890s, progressivism was huge and it lasted all throughout World War I. So that's 3 decades from 1890 to 1920. That's a long time for reform to be the name of the day. And so some people felt disillusioned with reform, especially because of World War I, because they tied progressivism with support of World War I. And it was supposed to bring in a new world order with a world court and a world Congress that would stop future conflicts, etc. And that obviously did not happen. So there was perhaps a sense of disillusionment. Freud in this generation was butchered. From what I understand a long time ago in college, is Freud talked about balance, right? And stating that you can't always subdue your id. Your id is your appetite, your instinct, what you want, right? But your superego is your internalized mom and dad that tells you, no, don't do that. That wouldn't be a wise decision. This would be a consequence of that, et cetera, right? And controls your id. But he said that if your superego is hyperactive and you live a very abstemious life where you abstain from ever giving into your id, he says you're going to fail to go through necessary stages like a child, starting as a child, right? Like the oral stage, the anal stage, these other stages, etc. That if you don't give into them, you're going to engage in repression. You're gonna push everything down and repress it down deep within your psyche and your subconscious. And some of the only times that those pent up feelings of the id ever get out and play, if you will, he said, is when you go to sleep and have dreams. But he said that's not enough. Sometimes you've got to give into your id or it's going to manifest itself. The suppression of it is going to manifest itself in certain types of neuroses. You're going to develop like OCD or some weird quirks that are unhealthy and so forth. But in the 20s, they oversimplified Freud And they said, well, you got to give in to your id or it's unhealthy. And I don't think Freud said that. I don't think he went that far. But that was the way Freud seems to have been interpreted in the 1920s, that you got to live and let live and go wild, or else it's going to have an unhealthy psychological effect on you as you grow older. And also postmodernism was big in art and in philosophy at this time and in the colleges. And amongst other things, a postmodernism that I don't recall it being a long time ago, having studied it, but I do remember that it adhered to moral relativism, that there is no such thing as right and wrong, that everything is relative. So could all of that have had an effect on this new woman? Okay. Should you choose number 2? To what extent did the Harlem Renaissance earn popular or institutional respect, tolerance, or inclusion? Well, for one, popularity and exposure. You look at crossovers from African-American community going on to Broadway, being on national tours, being broadcasted over NBC on the radio. Bessie Smith, Josephine Baker, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, the musical Shuffle Along, the writings of Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Claude McKay, Countee Cullen, they were largely read. And like I said, the Black and Tan organizations, the Black and Tan dance halls and so forth, you are going to see a degree of African Americans and white folk dancing with one another and enjoying one another's company, which of course was frightening to the racist and the conservatives. I'm on page 212 of Last Call, a book on prohibition. It says here in the newspaper, The Messenger, a columnist argued that the nightclubs have done more to improve race relations in 10 years than the churches, white and black, have done in 10 decades. And so contending, right, that the Harlem Renaissance was having an effect on tolerance and acceptance and coexistence, right? And even social camaraderie between black and white. You look at numbers of white population moving into Harlem, not moving, traveling, visiting Harlem. I'm sure you could find stats on that. The numbers were high. The numbers were evidently high, right? But at the same time, Harlem never integrated into a black and white community. It never diversified and became a successful white collar community, but it largely remained, long after the Harlem Renaissance, a segregated, poor and uneducated and marginalized part of New York, sadly. And then not to mention Josephine Baker. Look up Josephine Baker. There's a common thesis that the white men of that generation, they helped enrich her by purchasing her tickets. Okay. An example would be the banana dance, Josephine Baker doing the banana dance. But she oftentimes felt pressure by her consumers to be very sexual. So a lot of her dancing, a lot of her pictures. I mean, you just Google Josephine Baker and you'll probably find on Google image, a lot of them, she's scarcely if clad at all with clothing. She was meant to be a sex symbol. But in the same areas where she was performing, she was not allowed into the hotels. She was not allowed into some of the restaurants. And she was treated horribly because she was black. She ended up moving to France and she didn't want to come back. So she spent most of the rest of her life in France. And she had other factors as well. She had better career opportunities there, and she met a man that she married there in France as well, etc. But still, just look a little bit into a documentary on Josephine Baker, and you'll find that she became rather disgusted with America and how they treated. She felt used and abused by the white American public, because that's what they would do, is they would issue projection. They would enjoy the sexual theme to things, but then contend that that is what Black people do, not white people. That to them it's equivalent of like going to Vegas and anomalously out of the ordinary, going wild while you're there, but then you go back to your nice family life and everything when you return from Harlem. And so they put pressure on African Americans to help perpetuate that same Sambo image that the Harlem Renaissance was trying to rebut, right? And remember, the Sambo image is that these Black people are like animal-like, tropical people who are creatures of instinct, sexually aggressive, et cetera, et cetera. And so so on the one hand, right, you get a lot of publicity, you get a lot of participation, you get a lot of coexistence from the Harlem Renaissance, a lot of crossover. But on the other hand, you have frustration with people like Josephine Baker, where it seems like the Sambo image was not refuted. It was not blasted away. And then also the themes of some writers. Langston Hughes and Countee Cullen, I like to say that they experienced a bit of an identity crisis. Part of them wanted to be accepted by WASP white America. They carried themselves in a way that was nothing like the Sambo image. Very articulate, very self-possessed and self-controlled and abstemious, very intellectual, very ambitious, very creative. But at the same time, right, when you look at some of their works, their protagonists, their main characters, there's a book called by Langston Hughes, Not Without Laughter. There's a book by Claude McKay called Home to Harlem. And in both cases, you have a protagonist who is largely like them, sees himself as nothing like the Sambo image, very educated, ambitious. He's going to prove to the white American community that he is worthy of them, etc. Right? And then he usually has a buddy throughout the novel who does seem to epitomize the Sambo image, who wants to chase after white women and drink and live for the day and doesn't think about tomorrow, no ambitions, etc., etc. But by the end of the books, in both cases, in one of the books, the protagonist agrees that he wants to embrace both worlds. He wants to go to a white college, but he's proud of being Black, and he's proud of the people in his life from his Black community. The other one even goes further and contends that the protagonist grows disillusioned with white America, realizes it doesn't matter how impressively he can meet WASP standards, they will never accept him simply because of the color of his skin. And he sees the wisdom of his Sambo buddy and saying, you know what, kind of like the court jester in medieval literature, like this guy it wasn't just a happy-go-lucky, ignorant guy after all. He had a lot of wisdom and knew more about the world and knew more about white men than the educated one did. So very interesting to me. And then Claude McKay wrote a poem called If We Must Die, and basically likened Black men to a rooster caught in a pen, and the white slaughterer is coming for him. And it says, basically, if we're going down, we might as well go down swinging. And so with people like Claude McKay, Paul Robeson, and others, they ended up joining the Communist Party. Paul Robeson actually went and visited the Soviet Union, and we would not allow him to come back. And so some of them, right, contended that this new Negro, generically called a new Negro, was proud, Black and proud, and was not even certain that he wanted to be integrated into white society. And that's the opposite in many ways of W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP, right? The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, who fought for integration. They wanted the most talented 10th, educated, top quality African Americans to prove their worth as a race to white America and become accepted or integrated by it. And Marcus Garvey was a Jamaican who traveled the US and tried to convince African Americans to move back to Africa, that there was no hope for them here. So interesting stuff, the Harlem Renaissance. All right, so feel free to look more into that. Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston did a lot of work praising African American achievements and culture, and have the readers empathize with the plight of African Americans. All the while they were being paid so they didn't have to have a day job by a rich white woman. And at some points, the rich white woman wanted to look over their writings, their rough drafts, and have a say in what was put in their book. And of course, that was to great consternation and frustration to both of them. Thinking, right, I don't, that defeats the purpose with this Harlem Renaissance of me being the economic puppet of a white woman who can control what I do or do not write. Just a fascinating topic. Number 3, why do you think Prohibition failed? Okay, so very overtly, I state that it failed simply because the 18th Amendment was abrogated by the 20th Amendment that put an end to prohibition, okay, in 1934. So is there evidence that it was never that popular to begin with? Well, that's tough, because you look at all these different groups, they all coalesced in to be able to get prohibition passed. The populist, right, the small scale cash crop farmers, largely in the South and in the West, white Southerners who were racist and didn't want alcohol in the hands of Black men, progressives from the major cities who thought that alcohol was dysfunctional and kept the poor in their poverty and kept them from rising up. Many Christian denominations, Methodist and Baptist in particular, fought against the evil of alcohol as a sin and what it did to the nuclear family of mom, dad, and the kids. And then the Anti-Saloon League became a very strong lobbyist group under Wayne Wheeler, whereby they ruined people's careers that opposed them. They knew how to play politics and even fight dirty. And Billy Sunday was a traveling evangelist across the country, super popular, ex-baseball player, found Jesus, and really railed against alcohol. And representatives in Congress like Richmond Hobson did a lot in making sure that this was passed. But enforcement, $2 million, even back then, which that was much more back then, $2 million to enforce it, that's nowhere near enough. 1,500 federal agents at any given point. The highest it ever got to was 3,000 federal agents. 3,000 for the whole country. And then they needed the, quote, concurrent help from the states. But what happened in cities like Chicago when the mayor said he wasn't going to uphold prohibition? What happened in Philadelphia where they had to send the Marines in because there were so many dirty and corrupt cops and so much bootlegging going on in Philadelphia? Wisconsin, Minnesota, all kinds of Great Lake area states had plenty of evidence of defiance of prohibition. What was it, like 1 out of 10, if not even higher percentage than that? At least 1 out of 10 National Guard members was fired and punished and removed for taking a bribe along the 12,000 miles of coastline and allowing alcohol to go by and turn a blind eye to it. So it's just crazy the evidence for defiance of prohibition. The lobbyists, the brewers especially, the United States Brewers Association, they had millions and millions of dollars that they put into their political campaigns to try to end prohibition. But then also, what about culture? Like Hollywood, like President Harding's administration, like you saw in the colleges and in a lot of the the speakeasies of the cities. There seemed to have been a culture of deviance in the 1920s. It makes me think of like high school, right? Whereby you are encouraged, you receive peer pressure to defy your authorities, right? It's actually considered cool to defy your authoritative figures and what they tell you what to and what not to do. And then there were a lot of wets in the country who were for alcohol. And remember, to them, it wasn't about alcohol, it was about freedom. So in American political tradition, even if we're inconsistent about it, libertarianism is strong in American political tradition. Remember, that's you're fearful of government and you want it as small and unobtrusive into your life as possible. So you especially don't want the government involved in your private social life, right? Legislating morality. So those are just some thoughts. And then not to mention what I didn't mention also is because remember, it doesn't end until 1934 is the Great Depression. Literally, Franklin Roosevelt said the country needs a drink when they abrogated prohibition in 1934. So did they have bigger fish to fry? Did they find that perhaps they needed it for catharsis, right? To allow people to vent out their anger through escape in a ways that rather than rebelling against the government with so many people unemployed. Yeah, bigger issues, catharsis. There was another one I was going to put. Oh, and then also income. They could get income from taxing alcohol by reinstituting it. The government can get income. Yeah. All right. By taxation of alcohol. Number 4, to what extent were the traditionalist concerns reasonable or justified in your estimation? And you can go either route. But what I would recommend on this one is don't bite off more than you need to chew. You don't have to encompass every area in which the culture war was fought. So new women, prohibition of alcohol, the Harlem Renaissance, treatment of immigrants and ethnic minorities, the teaching of macrospecies evolution in public biology school classes. You know, you don't do all 5. That's crazy. So if you choose number 4, choose like 1, maybe 2 fields to suggest why you think the traditionalist concerns were or were not reasonable. So was there something to be concerned about with excess consumerism and people spending and spending and spending and not saving and getting themselves indebted on credit, going wild with the stock market and buying everything on credit? The young men and young women, can you think of any negative consequences of them somewhat going wild in the 1920s? And then Darwinian theory, of course, to the conservatives, right? What they're scared of is that it's going to invalidate in the minds of the kids the Bible. with the book of Genesis saying that God created man, Adam and Eve, separate from the animals. Because you have some people choose theistic evolution, right? People try to amalgamate the two, that God created everything, but that he allowed things to evolve, even evolve from one species to another. But that didn't seem to be an option back then. It seemed as if either God created them separately, as stated in the book of Genesis, or it's a lie. So a guy named John Scopes took the job, taught macro species evolution, knowing he was going to get fired, but knowing he was going to get backed up by the ACLU. The ACLU stood up for him against the school district that had fired him in Dayton, Tennessee, and it became a circus. It should have been about issues like academic freedom, who has sovereignty or control over curriculum, but instead it became a holy war, where Clarence Darrow drilled the defense on questions about the Bible and stories of the Bible and so forth. Scopes lost. The judge supported his being fired and the local school board's decision to do so. But he also, but the press was sympathetic toward him and painted a picture of the people of Dayton, Tennessee, and the conservatives and the religious folk as being backward. And then number 5, to what extent did hedonism, living for the moment, living for pleasure, or irresponsible decision-making or behavior during the Roaring 20s contribute to the Great Depression? So again, buying so much on credit, lack of savings, risky, irresponsible behavior in the stock market, farmers taking many risks and farming almost all of their arable land instead of allowing some of it to lay fallow. Big business being greedy and using tax cuts instead of ways that would trickle down, like opening new plants, hiring more workers, purchasing more machinery from the machinists. They instead simply bought more yachts, went on more trips, etc. So the money they saved in big business did not trickle down. The refusal of big business to allow their workers to unionize. Etc., etc. All right, so are there any questions as far as what I'm asking you to do?
I don't have any questions. Can you see me?
No, I can't. Huh?
I don't know what happened. Anyways.
Oh.
Okay. Well, I had a question. It's not regarding the questions, the assignment, but white collar and pink collar. So did pink collar jobs eventually just turn into white collar jobs the more males were integrated into those types of jobs?
No, that's a great question. Is a lot of the pink collar jobs that were considered feminine jobs just happen to be white collar. But for instance, a white collar job would be a lawyer. A white collar job would be a journalist. Those were not considered proper yet for women. So they were just merely white collar jobs, but not also pink collar. But being a secretary, being a telephone operator, right?
Mm-hmm.
Jobs like that happen to be white collar also, because you get paid a little better and you're not working with your hands. You're not engaging in manual labor. But at the same time, they're still considered appropriate for women.
Okay.
So
It
I
is.
hope, did that answer your question at all?
Did.
Okay,
Thank you.
good. You're welcome. All right. Okay, so if any other questions, that's it for me today for this week. I wish you well. Like I said, just go online under COVID circumstances. I'm not expecting you to get into a library and get an actual text. Feel free to go online. Feel free to look up documentaries and just cite at least one source on your page write-up.
Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome.
I
Happy
actually
to
had a
help.
quick one with this one.
All right, well, great. All right. Well, if there aren't any other questions, ladies, I'm putting down to give you both 10 points for sticking through and being the only ones here. And I'll go ahead and let you go.
One more question.
Yeah.
Crystal mentioned how long the write-up should be, and I actually did my write-up in a double spaced. Was that okay?
So it's double spaced and it's one page.
Yeah, but it reaches a little bit more than one page because I
Yeah,
wanted to
that's
make
okay
sure.
then.
Okay,
Yeah, that's okay then, Chrissy.
thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so have a great week, okay? Thank you for coming.